Hello and welcome to the Next Level Supply Chain with GS1 US, a podcast in which we explore the mind-bending world of global supply chain, covering topics such as automation, innovation, unique identity, and more. I'm your co-host, Reed.
And I'm Liz.
And welcome to the show. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Liz and I are so excited to have our first episode, and it's titled How Toilet Paper Broke the Supply Chain. We have a very special guest today. It's Sanjay Sarma, who is the Vice President of Open Learning at MIT and also the Professor of Mechanical Engineering and heads up the Auto ID Lab. Sanjay has been credited with developing many standards and technologies in the commercial RFID industry. He's also the co-author of The Inversion Factor, How to Thrive in the IoT Economy. Sanjay, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Reed.
Super happy to have you here.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you and to hear what you have up your sleeve to share with us and our audience about all things toilet paper and how it broke the supply chain. Before we get started, if you could just, give us a background of what you do at MIT, both from an open learning perspective, from, mechanical engineering perspective, as well as the work that the Auto ID Lab is doing.
Yeah, no, Liz, thank you. I have two roles. I'm a professor at MIT, and I led the Auto ID Lab. We did all the work in RFID with amazing colleagues from companies around the world, with labs around the world. I was the chairman of that research, and we continue to do research in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. It's very interdisciplinary. It's computer science, mechanical, electrical together. In RFID sensors, RF sensors, in IoT and so on. So that's sort of one half of my life. I also wear another hat. I am an administrator at MIT. I'm the vice president for open learning, which turns out to be a timely job to have during COVID, right? Because we develop content. I sit on the board of edX, and we develop content for massive open online courses and do other stuff online, including the science of learning. And I've done that for a few years, and MIT is basically at the forefront of digital learning as well. So that's my other life.
Thank you. Appreciate you sharing that. Let's jump right into this, and let's just talk about, supply chain and shortages and how they happen. I mean, the topic of today's conversation was how toilet paper broke the supply chain. We all kind of experienced this during the pandemic. And I think that for most folks, they think it's just, we ran out of supply. But there's a lot more to that, and there's digital components of this. Can you elaborate a bit more on that from your perspective?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are actually two different things philosophically one needs to take note of. The first is that we must recognize that there's a conflict between efficiency and resilience. So that's the first thing. So if you make something super efficient, you're not making it resilient. Let me give you an example. The most efficient way to fly a plane from Boston to San Francisco is for it to have just enough fuel and not a gallon more to get it to San Francisco. All right? Because then you're not carrying any extra fuel. So you're very efficient.
Yep.
And the problem with that is if there's weather somewhere and you need to reroute, well, you won't have enough fuel to land, right? It's not resilient. So that's the first thing. And for decades now, we have been on a push to efficiency, a push to optimize everything, optimize the heck out of everything. And that makes it not resilient. That's point number one. The other philosophical point is lack of information is spectacularly, what's the word I'm looking for, confusing in the supply chain or in any chain, not just the supply chain. If people start second guessing each other, then it creates ripples and it leads to cavitation, right? Anyone who's run a pump knows what cavitation is, when air bubbles form. And so the second piece is that when there is news about, oh my God, there's a pandemic coming, the pandemic's getting worse, or even something more simple like there's a storm coming, people go stock up. So we have a very efficient system. They're stocked up. They cavitated the supply chain. People upstream in the supply chain didn't know people downstream were buying so much. And everyone starts gaming, and you start forming waves, and the waves hit us as oversupply and undersupply.
I love the analogy, the talk about efficiencies and resiliencies, and then just the analogy of like an airplane. It crystallized it very quickly. So thank you for that. Liz, I think you had a question.
I do, and I like. Well, I don't like the idea of not having enough gas on a plane, right? But it gives us that picture of why you need to have a little bit extra, maybe, to make sure that you can ride that wave. But why toilet paper? I grew up in the Midwest, so we always had storms. Now I'm in the South, and if there's going to be a flake of snow, a flake, it's bread and milk that comes off the shelves. But this time it was toilet paper. And I know this is such a kind of boring question, but why one thing and not the other?
It's hard to find sort of pin down the psychology of toilet paper panics, but I think it also has to do with the toilet paper is very bulky. And it is one of those things when you think of why you need to go to the store, you absolutely have to go to the store. I guess it's toilet paper. So people stocked up on toilet paper because it's so bulky. You can't have massive reserves sitting around. A storm is a short-term thing. So you think, yeah, I get it. I have a few rolls. But then if it's a pandemic, you don't know how many months it's going to be. So you go, oh my God, I never want to go to the store again. I'll just go get it, right? So I think it has to do with that and the fact that it's hard to store for in the supply chain, just because it's so bulky. It's all air, basically.
That's a great perspective. I mean, we've been talking about it a lot, and you think of other things, but you said something. It's like when you have a storm, okay, I need this for like a week or two, but a pandemic, the panic set in, and it was like, well, you might be locked in for months, right? We don't know when we're going to be able to come back out. Let me come back to what you were just talking about earlier with the efficiencies versus resiliencies. Do you think what we just went through with the lack of toilet paper and then it was other supplies, do you think that for the supply chain and logistics industry that this was a blessing in disguise, or is there some other messaging we should be pulling from this?
I think we certainly have learned from it. Look, in the 2008 crash, we realized that our banks were very efficient, over-leveraged, had just enough fuel to land a plane if there were no disruptions, right? Fuel in the form of cash reserves. And then the crash hit, and then there was a run on the banks, very similar. It's like a run on toilet paper. And the banks, many of them keeled over. The government hadn't come in and bailed them out. Look where we would have been. I think this was and so after that, they started stress testing banks, right? And so this was a stress test to the supply chain. And I think the Amazons of the world, the online systems of the world held up. It's pretty spectacular, actually. The Walmarts of the world held up. So I think this is a shock to the system. But the supply chains, it's a little nuanced. They're different in different categories. It's one thing if you look at the supply chain of toilet paper. It's another thing if you look at the supply chain of milk, because it's fresh. And milk has to be stored differently, produced differently. And so yet another thing, if you look at the supply chain of procurement of masks, PPEs, if you recall in the early days, doctors and nurses didn't have masks. And the breakdown there is related, but also different, because what happened there was that the procurement systems in hospitals were not agile enough to adapt and procure from other sources. And the liability and the concerns about quality that sort of played into it. And so it's just the procurement systems couldn't procure. So doctors and nurses ended up procuring them privately almost, and getting their own masks because the hospital's procurement systems couldn't adapt. The person in charge of procuring PPEs doesn't want to take a risk. And so it broke down there. So my point is that, yes, it's been an absolute shock to the system. I hope we've learned from it. And I hope we realize that the supply chain is a national. It's like water. It's one of those emergency supplies thing. The nation depends on it, and if it breaks down, we're in trouble.
Yeah, no, we absolutely are. You're hitting so many topics here. I love the analogy again to the banks and the stress testing of 2008 and the Great Recession. And the fact that you just pointed out that, procurement is a big part of the supply chain, but it's also the form and function. You used milk. And I know with talking to family and friends, they're seeing on the news that all this milk is being dumped. And I'm like, well, because there's a challenge here. One, most of us go buy milk at the grocery store, and that's through the grocery supply chain. When milk is given at schools and at hospitals, and other institutions, they're buying through the food services supply chain. So it's same product, different form, different function. And so we're having a lot of conversations around that. I'm really glad that you brought that to the forefront here, because it's complex.
Yeah, it's complex. I'll give you an example from another country. Take, Delta viruses, Delta variants. This will date the podcast, but it's striking America right now. But it hit India 2 or 3 months ago, and there was a lot of talk about oxygen. And now, if you sort of look at it carefully, you realize it's a supply chain problem.
Yep.
It's not that India doesn't produce enough oxygen; it produces like 20, 30 times as much oxygen as is needed. But there are 3 ways to deliver oxygen. One is with a pipe. That's the most efficient way. But how many hospitals anywhere in the world have a pipe? They don't, right? The second is through cylinders. Well, hospitals aren't designed to keep people alive, numbers of people alive with cylinders. So there weren't enough cylinders. And the third way is to send concentrators, where you make it on the spot, on demand, right? And getting that portfolio right is a pure supply chain issue. And it took India time to figure it out. And other countries now are learning that lesson. But it's a supply chain issue.
Yeah.
Is there, do you think, those are good examples, and the supply chain is so very nuanced, just like you just said, with the 3 different ways of getting oxygen. Are there digital innovations that you see that could help supply chain leaders and those of us working in the supply chain to alleviate that kind of issue, to be more resilient?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are, but they're all sort of in the offing. They haven't happened yet. Some have. RFID was completely motivated by that, by the way. RFID was, the problem is, if I don't know there's going to be milk in the store next week, I'm going to buy twice as much this week. And that creates a ripple, right?
Yes.
But if you have visibility, and up and down the supply chain, if people don't hoard, then this flow is smooth. You see, we're all designed for, all our systems are designed for smooth flow, not lumpy flow. The moment you go lumpy, you're going to have upside, you're going to have downside. And downside means you run out. So RFID and all the stuff that GS1 does actually relates to supply chain visibility. So I think that's something we've worked on in the past and we're working on now. And you can extend it. So, for example, if a batch of vaccines was gone bad, the earlier because I don't know, the temperature was too high and it wasn't stored right, the earlier you know, the better, the more able you are to address it. So visibility is, I think, the most important one. The second one is, and that's visibility, by the way, not just in transit, but in storage, et cetera, right?
Yeah, full visibility.
Yeah, full visibility. So the second one is on-demand creation supply, right? And there is talk of that. I mean, when I talk about oxygen concentrators, right? I was talking to someone who lives in the Himalayas in India, and she goes, look, there's no way you can get cylinders up here fast enough. So send us oxygen concentrators, because that's like 3D printing oxygen, right? You're making it on the spot, on demand.
Mm-hmm.
So on-demand manufacturing is something that people are working on. Could we have made, PPEs on demand? We're not there yet, but I think that's a major innovation to figure it out. Can we make drugs on demand? Sort of, maybe, I mean, what we've done with vaccines is stunning, actually, if you think about it, but it wasn't really on demand. It took a year to test it, and then they spun up the manufacturing really quickly, and then there's contamination. But I think on-demand manufacturing addresses a lot of that, like oxygen concentrators. That's why I gave that example. I think those are 2 big ones. And then there'll be a whole lot of other things as well. For example, it's sort of visibility as well. But, imagine if testing were much more efficient. You could have treated things and positioned medicines differently. So all sorts of sensing, wearables, all that stuff. But I think these are early days, Liz. I think we're still in the old supply chain world. I've said this many times, and at the risk of being boring, I'll repeat it. I think the 21st century begins this year. It did not begin in 2000 or 2001. This is the year that we are going to reinvent the way we live and with each other and on this planet.
Yeah, actually, I have two things I want to get to. So I'm just going to get to the first part. Is you were talking about the visibility and the flow. We run a startup lab pitch competition here at GS1 US, and it's always very exciting and creative and to see new things. And last year we had a smart garbage can solution. And most folks looked at it as like, this is reordering. And the amount of data that could be collected from a smart garbage can was really mind blowing to me. And it was on so many different levels. And it just succinct for me with what you talked about with this visibility. It's now the grocer knows what its community is actually really doing. So like, yes, you bought milk, but you left it in the backyard because you were afraid to bring it in the house because of the pandemic, and it's spoiled because you're in a 95-degree environment. So we anticipated you wouldn't be back for 10 days, but now you're coming back in 2 days because you dumped it out. If it went into the smart garbage can, we would have had some of that visibility. Are those some of the things you were alluding to?
Absolutely, 100%. That's called demand sensing and demand management. Just, I use the oxygen example. We talked about toilet paper, we talked about milk, we talked about PPEs. But just to expand our minds, I'm going to use a very different example: electricity. If we all turn our air conditioners on at exactly the same moment, the grid can't keep up with it.
No.
Right? So now there are three things people are doing. One is local storage. That's what the Tesla Powerwall is, for example. So if there's a sudden spike, you draw it from your Tesla Powerwall, right? So you don't hit the grid. The second is signaling to the grid. And so they have these smart meters that signal to the grid that, wow, this whole neighborhood, power usage is going up. So there's something called spin capacity. They can spin it up quickly like a gas turbine to generate more power into the grid. It's a supply chain. And the third is demand management, which is they tell you, listen, slab pricing, if you charge your car or turn your dryer on at 3 a.m., it'll be much cheaper and the grid gets smoothed out. It's all about smoothing. So the smart garbage can is no different than a smart meter. It all comes down to information and planning and smoothing what is otherwise a whiplash. There's a whole way to describe it. It's called the bullwhip effect, which I can tell you. And there's actually a game which is designed by a colleague at a very well-known professor at MIT called the beer game, which I assure you does not involve drinking beer. It's just a simulation that shows this.
Dang.
Liz, we're going to need to make a note to have Sanjay back to talk about the electricity piece, because that's a whole other topic, and that's supply chain. I think that's a great analogy. My other question where I was going to go to is you talked about, the old supply chain and, the new things coming forward is you hear folks talk on the street and in our communities and family, around the table is, when are things going to get back to normal? When are they going to get back to normal? What's your take on that? Like, I don't see first off, what is normal? Second, that's what it was. I don't see us going back to it. I just think that life is forever evolving, and for the most part for the good, but I'd love to get your perspective on it.
Look, the supply chain is today largely a push supply chain. The idea is you push things to a store, and then people go in and they pull things from the store. Your household may consume twice as much cheese as mine this weekend because you have guests over, and I'm just going to be doing yard work. But it averages out, so everything works out. Now, that broke down because we all started behaving unpredictably, and so the push supply chain couldn't keep up with it, and stores had to pull faster than the supply chain could provide, and there were holes, and that's why we ran out of toilet paper. But one thing that has happened in the pandemic is we've woken up to a new reality where we've learned the power of pull as consumers. And I think we're going to go to a much more pull-based supply chain. And I think that online and all the other omni-channel stuff gets more signaling into the supply chain. And my view is that we will never go back to the old normal. I think we're going to go to a new normal. I think that retail will have to reinvent itself somewhat. People will go back to stores, a lot of people, but I think that a lot more stuff will be subscription basis. There'll be a lot more adaptability. Retail will be much more about introducing you to new experiences, and but they'll have to figure out how to play in the subscription game. But regardless, I think that consumers have suddenly realized the power in their hands, and there's going to be longer tail of products, more custom, more different types of business models like subscription, and the focus of the supply chain where it comes to in person is going to be more on sort of the experience, the pleasure, the thing that's different. I mean, take this. I just bought a pair of pants from a company called Proper Cloth. I went to a website and they asked me all sorts of questions, and they custom made the pants and send them to me from Vietnam. All right. Will I ever go back to, I don't know, Brooks Brothers and buy a pair of pants there anymore because the fit is not great? No, I'll go it this way. So Brooks Brothers has to rethink how they serve me. Maybe they're more of a showroom. So I think we're entering a whole new round now.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting.
And it really is, like you said, the power is literally in the consumer's hands. So, as we're holding our phone, we can order a shirt or pants or food or what have you. And it really does force the retailers to move more quickly. And I know, talking to retailers that are members of GS1 US, they've had to totally change everything that they've been doing very quickly, whether they were planning to or not. So it's just been an amazing shift before our eyes in the past year, 18 months now, I guess. So shifting a little bit away maybe from supply chain, I know you're an expert in RFID. RFID has been something that, from our members' perspective, food service is dabbling. We've got apparel and general merchandise utilizing it. What new innovation do you see on the horizon? Do you think it's RFID being more widely adopted and used, or is it something else?
Yeah, to me, RFID is just one component of the digitization of the supply chain, which may include things like sensors, EPCIS, which is a way to essentially share visibility across enterprises or within an enterprise. So that whole ecosystem, I think, is going to flesh out. I'll give you an example. So we have taken to ordering cheese from a cheese supplier. It gets shipped to us. Never did that before, right? But the fact that it's shipped, it has to be shipped cold. We've also ordered Indian food because I'm Indian, and I do sometimes miss a particular delicacy, and it comes to us from California, from a cloud kitchen there, and it comes with various forms of cooling, and it holds up. It's a 2-day shipment, 2.5-day shipment. So but then I don't know. I just checked the temperature of the cold packs, but did something go wrong? Did the food get exposed to a temperature it should not have? And so I think that what we're going to see is end-to-end visibility, and then you add to that counterfeit. So one of the great advantages of going to a store is I know that Walmart procurement, which is really great, or Target procurement, which is really great, or Stop and Shop, I know there's very unlikely to be counterfeit. But if I'm getting stuff online, I don't know. In fact, as you know, that's become a bit of a news item recently. So essentially, anything that gives me confidence, RFID could be a part of it, and probably will be, is going to be essentially where a lot of this happens. A lot of food, though, as you said, is food service. It goes to the back end of a restaurant, and there, some of that information gets lost anyway. I depend on the restaurant. But if it's direct to home, I think it'll push the boundaries and the requirements on trust.
Wow, I'll tell you, I would love to continue conversations for a long time, but we're going to have you come back on the show. But before we wrap up, I think we have about time for 2 more questions here. And, just from a personal standpoint, I mean, you see a lot of things every day, and we're always just trying to better ourselves and just try to expand our minds and look at new things and be more efficient or more effective or more resilient or more whatever. What is your favorite technology today, right now? What's the favorite thing that you're either working with in the lab or that you're using personally or professionally or both?
I have a sort of a mixed answer to it. I am absolutely fascinated by blockchain, and I can find very few killer apps for it. But I'm just fascinated by it. The whole story is extraordinary, and the concept behind it is just amazing. Now, it's a different matter that I found one killer app, maybe two, but I can't find a lot of killer apps outside of Bitcoin. But that's where my mind is right now.
Interesting. I appreciate you sharing that.
Okay, so to wrap us all up, so in our lives, there's these moments that make you stop and think, oh my gosh, I had no idea that was the way it was, or is the way it is, or hummus is made from just chickpeas, what have you, right? What mind-bending thing have you learned recently that's just kind of stopped you in your tracks?
I have a sort of a philosophical answer to that, which is this. Many years ago, I used to wonder who made up something that we all take for granted. I mean, who ate the first lobster?
Right.
Who thought to eat that thing, that creepy crawly thing at the bottom of the ocean, become something everyone wants to eat? So, or who made up, a term that we all know, like Six Sigma? And I realized it was just another human being, mostly flesh and blood. And so it occurred to me that if you have a good idea, say it. And just, if you really believe in it, and you have to believe in it, maybe someday it'll become a part of the lingua franca. So that's my sort of philosophical mind-bending discovery is just make it up if you believe it.
I absolutely love that, the whole lobster bit. But if you go and YouTube 212 degrees, they have a group out there. It's this extra degree of effort. And it's, who's the first one to boil water and see what something happened? Like, did the first scientists give up at 100 degrees or 150 degrees or 200 degrees? So I love that idea. Sanjay, unfortunately, we're out of time, and if you would agree to, we'd love to have you back for more conversations. Would you be open to that in the future?
It'd be a pleasure. Good to see you both. And yeah, absolutely. Call me anytime.
Because the knowledge that you dropped on us today was profound. I mean, efficiencies versus resiliencies, and just the airplane analogy just crystallized it. The stress testing of the banks and the stress testing of the supply chain, the bullwhip effect, and then just if you have an idea, share it. So thank you for taking the time today and sharing your experiences and wisdoms with us. It's greatly appreciated.
Yes,
such a pleasure, Reed and Liz, and take care and stay safe.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you for joining the Next Level Supply Chain with GS1 US. If you enjoyed today's show, you can subscribe to our feed or explore more great episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to share and follow us on social media. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.